Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So the first part of this session is actually going to be a panel, and it's on enabling multiscale science. And it's going to be moderated by Claudia I'm going to say your name terribly.
Bowser.
Medeiros. And she's going to be joined by Roberto Cesar and James Hunt. So I'll turn it over to you to get started, and then I'll take questions. I'll run around with the microphone. This is being recorded, so I'll take questions at the end.
Okay, so thank you very much. The idea here is that we are going to present different kinds of problems concerning interaction and working with multiscale data and the multiscale world we work with and live in. And from two complementary points of view, the point of view of the person who is actually going to work with the data, the scientist, the expert on the problems, and from the computer science point of view. And I'll start with the expert, James. Okay.
Thank you, Claudia. I really enjoy coming to these meetings because I learn all the things I don't know, and I wish I knew. From the beginning.
There, yeah.
So thank you for allowing me to participate in this workshop and conference and panel. What I'm going to be addressing is really hydrology and scaling issues that show up in hydrologic sciences, which the bottom line is it's a data-rich and analysis-poor area. In fact, we're not taking advantage of the data that's there, and I just want to go through an example of how we've tried to do that. Obviously, I haven't done this alone. Graduate students do all the work, and my collaborator, Catherine Van Ingen, formerly with Microsoft, got me into this with the ability of looking at these tools. And Lawrence Berkeley National Lab obviously was essential in getting that started up. I think it needs to start off any discussion of hydrology to ask, well, what scale are you working at? And I like this picture. It's a place in Northern California called Dry Creek. It's a watershed, part of the Russian River watershed, a little bit north of the Bay Area. And you can look at this at just any number of scales you want, from the individual leaf, or drill down to a stomata in a leaf, to the flower, to the stem, to the individual plant, the plant on a hillside, the microtopography, and then the human interactions that go on these watersheds, the vineyards in the lowlands, the forests, the chaparral in the upper parts of the watershed. In addition, there's a creek actually running down the center of this, which has one of the few last remaining habitats for migratory salmon in the central coast of California. And the question is, how do you manage this system to preserve all these features that everybody says they'd like? The wine, the salmon, the environment. And it's all about scaling. So I'm going to do it really simple. I'm going to look at an overhead watershed water balance, where we've got water coming in by precipitation under this watershed boundary. That water, I'm going to assume in this model, only leaves two ways. Either it evaporates and transpires from plants and free water surfaces, or it runs off R. And we, in hydrology, have been doing these water balance models for a few centuries now. We're almost getting them right. But basically, precipitation P becomes runoff R, and what transpires plus any change in moisture in the soil or groundwater. What the advantage is in working in Mediterranean climates like California is if you look at what happens every October 1st, it's always dry. And it's pretty much the same amount of dryness from one October 1st to the next. So if you pick a time step for this calculation of 1 year, every October 1st, the conditions are about the same. And so this storage term, the amount of water in soil, and groundwater is about the same every year. So to test this model, I went off and looked at a watershed by hand, grabbing data off the web from the U.S. Geological Survey, grabbing precipitation data from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, our weather people, and calculated the runoff depth, R, for each year, and plotted that versus the precipitation depth for that year for 50, 60 years from 1940 to 2006. The only way to do this at the time was to go manually out to the websites for these individual organizations, download it, convert units, make sure they were at the same time intervals, which doesn't sound all that complicated, and it wasn't. It was just tedious. And doing it once by hand was more than you wanted to do again. So the question is there an alternative? And there was through our association with the Microsoft research folks. And we went to the Russian River watershed and demonstrated how to do this for 5 different gauges going down the watershed. So this is the Russian River watershed north of the Bay Area again. I've listed 5 gauging stations run by our United States Geological Survey. And the idea is, can you come up with a relationship similar to what we saw in the previous diagram that allows you to scale from someplace at the top of the watershed near Ukiah that actually applies at Hopland, that applies at Cloverdale, Healdsburg, and Guerneville? Can you scale between different size watersheds in the same area? And so if you plot then the runoff data as a function of precipitation, picking one location in the middle of the watershed, Healdsburg, you get these 5 watersheds that range in area from 256 square kilometers up to 3,400, so over a factor of 10 in watershed area. And the data with some scatter all looks about the same. And the way to describe that data is a single parameter model, if you will, of the intersection of that dashed line with the x-axis at about 400 millimeters. Basically, it says this watersheds, or these watersheds, you need about 400 millimeters of precipitation before anything runs off. And then everything that happens after 400 millimeters runs off. That line, the dashed line, has a slope of 1. It's a really simple hydrology model. The Russians knew this back in the 60s and the 70s. We've gone back and forth with it, whether we like it or not. But on an annual basis for Mediterranean climates, if you want to know what's going on, this is the first place to start. This, using data cube technologies and having systems pulled in from those separate organizations, was convenient. 5 watersheds, 10 watersheds. But the question then was, could we do it for the whole state of California? And that was a challenge. And one of the challenge has to do with precipitation, rainfall. And this is a contour plot of annual precipitation in the Napa Valley watershed, which is just to the right of the Russian River one. And these contours show you that you get a lot of spatial variability in precipitation, as you would know, and in particularly microclimates in California seem to be something that flat Chicagoans don't understand, except the lake effect. And so the blue is high precipitation on the left, where the hills are, and the orographic effect. The bottomlands of the valley in the middle, you get lower amounts of annual precipitation. My previous analysis was done with a precipitation gauge at one location. It didn't take advantage of the interpolated knowledge that sits in this contour plot that came out of Oregon State University's analysis. So we used that to come up with precipitation over watersheds that tried to do this interpolation. And when we did that through over 200 watersheds in California that are unimpaired, that is, they don't have dams on them, they don't have large agricultural use, they don't divert water in, they don't divert water out, they don't have significant groundwater pumping that's changing this annual storage, you end up with these watersheds. And this is not bad in terms of coming up with the spatial distribution of this one parameter. Call it ET naught, if you will, the ET parameter there, in millimeters of water required before runoff starts happening. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to show you that it looks pretty good, and then I'm going to show you why it doesn't look good in terms of scaling. So this is the plot of runoff versus precipitation, but I normalize the precipitation by subtracting off at the bottom there the fitted value of ET, the evapotranspiration, for each watershed. So each point up there represents 1 year in one watershed. And there's over 200 watersheds represented on this, of all the data for each of those watersheds. So it's a lot of data, and that dashed line is this model. And it works reasonably well, but this is hydrology, therefore there's noise. Okay? So I want to conclude almost by going back to this map and saying what worried us about this is in terms of scaling, you would hope that watersheds next to each other would have the same value of this parameter. The climatology is similar, the geology is similar, but they don't. And one example is in Central California. You're looking here where you go from blue to white to brown, which is a dramatic change in this single parameter. And the question is, why is it doing that? And our speculation at this point, which means I don't have the answer to all this, is our precipitation fields are challenged by the microtopography in California. What we would have liked to have been able to do is show you a picture here where there was a very consistent story saying, northern wet California, we have one value. As you move south, you get another value. You move next to the coast, you have a value of this parameter, such that we could predict watersheds that weren't gauged. This is the holy grail of hydrology, predicting what's going on in ungauged watersheds. So progress thus far, we have lots of data on the web, but picking that off individually and doing the analysis on one watershed was tedious, but it got us started in this business. The data cube that we used that pulled that data that we wanted from California into one location made it easy to do sort of the 5 to 10 watershed scale analysis, but it wasn't what could be done, or it wasn't easy to extrapolate out to hundreds of watersheds, and therefore we had to go to the cloud to do that. And last comment that's a little cynical if anybody that isn't a hydrologist. Most of us hydrologists believe in studying one watershed, so n equals 1 is our life story. We need to go out bigger than 1, probably bigger than 10, I think on the scale of hundreds, which really does some challenging data management and analysis requirements, so we can deal with some of the complexity that you see there. Thank you. I'm going to hand it off to Roberto now. Well, the panel, our chair is in charge here.
I'm the panelist, so I decide when I present.
That's
which
right.
is right now.
You.
Okay, thank you.
That's why I'm not in charge.
No, I don't need the microphone. Thank you. Oh, you need the microphone. I'm sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity of letting us talk about these exciting problems and dealing with multiple scales and space and time, and also multiple scales and scientific focus. And I'm going to continue from where James stopped and talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done before in Brazil within a Microsoft FAPESP-funded project, and what we are doing right now in another project that has just started, also funded by Microsoft and FAPESP, as well as other Brazilian agencies. So the idea, this is not, Datascope is an idea I like. It's not my name, but in fact, when we look at what Galileo did, Galileo looked through telescopes, and now if Galileo was alive, he would be looking at the data generated by telescopes. However, in the multiscale world, there are also microscopes. So how do we handle that? What are the computing problems? What are the scientific problems that we are faced with? And what about constructing not only datascopes that analyze data, but scale scopes that would analyze data across scales, data and models? And this is an example extends what you showed, which is when you go from one scale to another. I'll borrow a little bit from agriculture and compose with what James presented, where this scenario is a little bit the same. You have to combine data from satellites where one pixel may cover large amounts of land, say 100 by 100 kilometers or 10 by 10 kilometers, and it has to be combined with ground sensor data. Again, you also did your work, James, combining some ground data sensors and gauges and together with some satellite data. So how do we work with that? To give you just a small example, you have the blue curve is biomass curve as derived from analysis of time series of satellite image data over 1 pixel or over a few pixels. Whereas the red curve is temperature data for the same region, but of course interpolating lots of sensors. So here you have the first problem, where temperature comes from a set of sensor networks, and biomass information comes from satellite information. And this is a simulation of what might happen to sugarcane. And you see that temperature will, in the future, affect what will happen to biomass. But it's not only temperature, there's lots of other factors involved. And at the end, you see there's a deep fall in biomass index. And that's not because there's something to do with temperature, but because there was harvest time. So all of a sudden, the factors that influence what is happening may change. And we cannot have one single model to start with. And second, this model varies with time according to human intervention. So recurring multiscale problems, from what James mentioned and from these, and what Roberto is going to say, first of all, there's this problem of data. Okay, data is heterogeneous through space, through time, multiple scales in space and time. So how do we integrate these sources, especially if there is indirect effects? And also, I might say that the person who's going to present right after us is going to talk about archaeology. And it's not about predicting the future, it's about predicting the past and how multiscale data interacts with the past. So how to visualize all of that. James showed very nice visualizations of all kinds of things. Then there is a sophisticated series of events in space and time, and complex interactions within a scale in space, within a time period, but also across. And Roberto is going to show us a little bit more about that. So how should and can we model these changes? How do we trace them as the world evolves? And there's also model heterogeneity, because there are complementary views of the world. These are just a few of these problems. So a few ideas from what we are doing in Brazil, but also from different kinds of work and people working with multiscale phenomena. First of all, annotations, okay? So this is an example of an expert annotating those two kinds of curves for sugar cane, and to help understand the interaction of these phenomena. So how can we help experts annotate? We can provide tools that not only will help the annotation task itself, but to interact with worldwide ontologies. This graph is an example of the linked data initiative, which is an initiative that is converting Wikipedia into huge semantic graphs so that you can navigate from one concept to another. Of course, this is all based on public information, but you can help interaction across scales and across levels by providing a semantic interaction of ontologies. The second idea would be, we deal with lots of different complex time series, so how do we extend time series mining? Standard mining goes through finding patterns in one series or in a couple of series, but always considering that everything happens within that time period. Whereas we are dealing with series where the effect of one phenomenon will only be felt days or years afterwards, as witness the keynote that we heard this morning. So how do we go about, once you have a different set of phenomena that evolve together with differences in scale and time, finding out similar patterns so that we can predict what is going to happen? And these are screen copies from some of our work in Coevolving series. The third idea that where computer scientists can help in multiscale scenarios is working with aggregations, graphs, and workflows. And you'll see more about workflows as Roberto talks, but again, this is a huge graph. And you can see the world at different, from different perspectives, different scales, and at each scale you have interactions intra, and then you have interactions across scales. And you can also start wondering about how can workflows interact when you are considering multiple scales and each set of workflows is working at a given scale. The other thing, which is right now we are working on, also financed by Microsoft and FAPESP, is this is a watershed evolution scenario at 2 scales, and this is supported by an underlying versioning, database versioning system, where you allow the scales to interact and you keep constraints across scales. So this is the evolution, and at the leftmost part of each of these screens, you have the versioning. This is a screen copy, and the interactions across versions. So this is the example of the world evolving at multiple scales. First is just for one scale, and you have alternative scenarios of what might happen or what is happening depending on what the expert wants to study. And then you have the same thing for the second, the third, and the fourth scale. And then you have all of these are stored as database versions, and you can provide interactions across them. And finally, the last idea, and we saw a little bit of it earlier this morning. I saw a lot of it from what James showed of all his visual analysis, is to profit from visual analytics. I'm not going to present any nice screen copies, but animations. Microsoft's Worldwide Telescope and layers can provide this. We saw this earlier this morning. And there's also another, unfortunately, I just forgot the name, but Microsoft people, what? Layerscape. No, there's Layerscape, but there's also the zoo thing. Chronozoo, yeah. So these are ideas that can be taken advantage of, systems that are already running, where you can visualize interactions across scales. So I'll finish here, and Roberto now is going to take the stand to talk about modeling.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I would like to thank the opportunity to come here. When Claudia invited me, I thought what would be a nice, some good complementary point of view regarding what James and Claudia would talk. And because of my background, I choose to talk a little bit about some mathematical and computational fundamental problems or perspectives whenever we are trying to include multiscale techniques in order to analyze scientific data. I would like to talk a little bit about these, some of these aspects that I think they're important. Here's a summary of my talk. Well, first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about the concept of what we are naming a scale. Then to speak a little bit about some fundamental tools or concepts that are important, and then some concluding remarks. First of all, there is the important thing regarding what we are calling a scale actually, because in scientific phenomena, scientific data, there are many different aspects and concepts that may regard a scale actually. We may be talking about spatial scales, but we are also maybe talking about temporal scales and even conceptual scales. I would like to highlight these three different point of views related to what we call scales, and maybe there may be some other point of views. This is an example that appeared today already in the invited talk, and also Claudia mentioned. When we are talking about spatial scales, there is something related to space in general. There are many different sensors that may acquire spatial information. And the good thing is that whenever we're talking about spatial scales, at least there is this spatial thing that may help us, for instance, to map information and to create and to understand how to go from one scale and another, etc. What I'm talking here is that the space helps us whenever we have to think about the analytical method that is going to be employed, actually. Then there is this good aspect. And also an additional thing is that it's kind of quite intuitive. People understand what space is and what are the spatial phenomena, etc. Then it's a more easier way. But then we have also temporal scales. These are kind of a little bit more subjective, and there may be some different things hidden in it. Here I'm going an electrocardiogram signal in A. It's just an example of an application, and a mathematical tool that is useful, that has been used for some 20 years now to analyze this kind of signal. Then we have here the doesn't work. In A, and in B, what we have is the wavelet transform of this signal when we can look at different phenomena in different scales associated to the first signal. Here, there is an important thing to mention is that actually these scales themselves, they don't belong to the original data. The mathematical tool is responsible to unfolding the original information that is presenting the original data into a number of different scales. This is a kind of different thing regarding all the features that we mentioned here. I'm going to come back to this in some slides. And then we have the third, what I'm calling a conceptual scale, when actually we may have some spatial structure, we may have some temporal structure, but actually the scale in this sense is much more conceptual than anything. This is an example, okay? There are other examples that we may create, but this is a quite important example in eScience and bioinformatics nowadays, what we call systems biology approach, where we have some different phenomena that are recognized by biologists, for instance. Then we have the central dogma of biology, where we have the DNA transcript into mRNA, then there is translation into proteins. The proteins control metabolites, and then the metabolites control the organs themselves. Of course, we are able to extract information from all these layers that we are seeing here. And, but the point here is that the different scales that are present here, they are not spatial scales because regarding space, we don't know if things that are happening in one layer are smaller or larger than the others, for instance. There is also, it's not exactly a phenomenon that there are temporal scales involved. They may be involved, but all the things, they may happen all together, actually. Then, when we are talking about this kind of phenomena, actually we are talking about conceptual scales. scales that are presenting the theory behind the data. And sometimes it's more difficult to model this kind of stuff. And all the problems that we just mentioned, that Claudia mentioned, James mentioned, they may appear, but without the help of having an underlying structure like space or time or something like this. And then there is a second order conceptual scales, because we may start extracting abstract data structures or models or something like this that explain such data to original data. And then the scales may start appearing. For instance, here what I'm showing in the bottom right part is some gene networks that are extracted from such data, and their scale may start appearing in this data structure. And this data structure is not presenting the original data, and all the problems start to appear again and again. Well, once we have this kind of different scenario that appear when we are talking about scales, it's important to mention that there are some problems where scale is an inherent concept, actually, like space or time or something like this. And sometimes we don't have scale as something intrinsic to the data. We may have to create, actually, this kind of concept or this kind of data, for instance, using some mathematical tool. There are some different mathematical tools that are available, and depending on the method, we may have to choose one or the other, like wavelets, for instance, pyramids and graphs, as Claudia mentioned, et cetera, et cetera. And depending on the approach that we take, on the path that we take to model the problem, there are computational methods and data structures that may support this. Let me come back to the problem that I mentioned a little bit when we are talking about conceptual scales and conceptual data. For instance, if we take the DNA as the source of the data that we want to analyze, this is an example of an application where people want to find gene coding regions, actually. In this case, the scale is actually represented by biochemical structures. We are not talking about any longer about spatial scales, time scales, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, coding is quite important in this sense. Once we have this information coded, we have to create the scales, data from the original data. What I'm calling here unfolding. In this case, using wavelet transform, we could use some different things. But this is just half of the path, actually, because once we have that, sometimes we have to actually collapse the information into monoscales in order to find information. This is what we call folding. Then these are all important steps in modeling problems in order to be solved with multiscale methods. I think I'll skip this. I'll try to be brief. I would like to talk about how to create this kind of second-order conceptual scales, an approach to infer networks, but maybe it's kind of just too technical for the panel. I may enter into detail afterwards. It's just kind of Markov random chains that may be applied to infer the networks using entropy. And after all this, we have to have software, of course, giving support to the scientist in order to infer the information. And the multiscale browsing, the browsing of the multiscale data comes from such structures. And finally, we have now mappings between scales that are created actually from the networks extracted from the data. Okay, I try to summarize the point of view that I'm trying to create here. The point I'm trying to make here. There are different types of scales, and it's important to characterize from the data what type of scales that are involved, actually. There are some problems where scale, they are intrinsic from the problem. Then maybe we can extract structure and explore structure from such data. But sometimes they are not intrinsic from the data. Scale may be actually an abstract concept, theoretical concept, and sometimes we cannot measure it. I mean, we have to have mathematical tools and then algorithms that are going to extract the data, the scale information from the data. That's what I'm calling unfolding and folding these scales. There are mathematical models to cope with all these. I mentioned some of the examples, wavelets, for instance, graphs, and resolution parameters, etc., etc. And depending on the path that we take, we have to use computational models and software to give support to it. Finally, there are some good clues, some good aspects of using multiscale techniques. First of all, using multiple scales is a kind of way of coping with complexity from the data. And multiple scales allow a lot the development of techniques for exploratory data analysis. When you start studying the problem and you simply don't know what to do, using multiscale techniques is a good way to initially trying to grasp some intuition about the data, understanding. And in general, multiscale techniques allow mathematically some good models to do data integration. Then when we are talking about data integration, actually, it's important to have some mathematical structure behind it so that we can explore the data integration algorithms based on the models. And finally, a last aspect that is important regards the analysis of networks. Claudia mentioned a little bit some of these problems. That's what I'm talking about: network matching, searching, comparison, and motifs. Well, that's it.
Okay, I'll just talk for 2 seconds more. Thank you. Just summing up, we started with James that presented us a concrete example of multiscaling in hydrology, okay? And taking also advantage of georeferencing and geographic location to help solve lots of the big integration problems and modeling problems that you have. Then I presented a couple of problems that deal with time and space. And Roberto went on and introduced conceptual scaling within modeling and talked about biology. I'd just like to mention, for those who are interested and are not aware of it, a recent issue of Communications of the ACM on computational folkloristics also talks, if you read the paper with a scale perspective, also talks about multiscaling in folklore and how you can find elves and dwarfs and all kinds of folklore creatures looking at different scales using data integration, exploratory data analysis, and all these things we've been talking about. So scaling, this would be conceptual scaling in the humanities. So there's a wide spectrum of scaling problems. Thank you.
Okay, so are there any questions? And I'll run the microphone over to you. Oh, okay, Harold, sure.
So I think you touched on this. As we look at problems which have multiple timescales and the same variables in each timescale, do you have results, or are you aware of results where the problem becomes simpler at some timescales than others, where you're able to do aggregation in effective ways, and do you have to do that manually, or do you have data analysis tools to do that? Roberto may actually have an answer to that from his comments about Markov chains, but it seems interesting to me the problems and the way we treat them, for instance, in the cloud may be affected by that as well.
From my experience, analyzing different scales from time signals, the classical way is the data that we can find, the information that we can find, first of all, is by analyzing frequencies and using Fourier analysis and this kind of stuff. Then we are able, in general, to grab information from the original data that we cannot see directly once we are talking about the data itself. But the point there is that, in general, we lose time precision, actually. then these kind of multiscale techniques, they are useful whenever you want to characterize this kind of information you're looking for, information that is not directly, for instance, because of hidden patterns or something like this in the data, but you would also like to be able to precisely say where this pattern they occur. That's why we call this kind of techniques mathematical microscopes, actually. They are ways, and people using, for instance, analysis from astronomical data that Claudia mentioned, they use a lot this kind of techniques. Then my answer is yes, in this sense, and more modern techniques, they try to use both variables in order to cope. I would say.
Thank you, Harold. That was an interesting question. In the case of hydrology, in my particular approach, there's a whole lot of temporal variability at the second, minute, day, week, month period that just smooths itself out when you look at the annual processes. And so that way, you didn't have to understand the minutia of a raindrop landing on a leaf, falling on the soil, infiltrating or running off. The system smoothed that out. So the filtering happened as you went up at a longer time scale and made it, I thought, easier. Not everybody agrees or wants to get rid of that complexity.
And if I might add, another example is traffic. Okay, so you can have a big picture if you go through sensors throughout the year, and unless there's been some accident, you have seasonal events in traffic that you can aggregate, and you can do urban planning based on these temporal series of cars passing by places, and then you can see there's always a market here, so there will be a road to deviation in this place every Sunday, or this is the Chicago Marathon, and this is a once-in-a-year event that requires changes in traffic. But from the hydrology perspective, you can look at traffic flow. Oh, I'm just inventing this, but I like the idea. And you can kind of aggregate time events this way.
I actually really love the fact that you chose multiple disciplines, and particularly I loved bringing in that folklore one at the end, which is a surprise to me. But obviously, scale is a persistent problem across different domains, no matter what the domain. Claudia, you mentioned ontologies, and specifically, and the Lincoln Project, the Wikipedia project. As a person who's done machine learning and natural language processing, one of the things I always find with ontologies is they sometimes add the computational complexity. And while we have the cloud that Jim mentioned to do that, I'm wondering, do you think, is that truly something that could be applied to it, or is it something that could maybe just add also to the complexity of it? Because it's not language is a fluid thing, right? It changes over time. And even within disciplines, as we publish more papers, language time moves over time. So what are your thoughts?
Okay, the cloud certainly will help because it gives you more computational power and it allows you to integrate more stuff. But natural language processing is a big problem. And Roberto and I come from different places in Brazil, and sometimes we have to translate concepts to each other. I mean, not all the time, but and the same happens everywhere. So I think the cloud will help, but what we really need are really good algorithms and contextual stuff, okay? Because as you very well know, vocabulary evolves with time and within a context. And the same word will acquire lots of meaning. So ontologies by themselves, and this is a very good point, cannot help unless they're placed within a time context and a usage context. Otherwise, it's just words. Good point. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to thank the panel for their wonderful talk. Oh, did I miss somebody? Oh, I'm sorry, Harold. Cutting you off.
Your first answers generated a second question, which is regarding transient analysis for disturbances. It seems to me, for instance, we all of us seem to talk more and more of the average temperature is changing, but we're also talking about the disturbances in weather patterns. At least it seems heuristically to be different to me in the places I'm living. So have there been analysis that you talked about the natural filtering, for instance, Jim, of the water, but has there been also transient analysis and to know that even though they average out, is there studies of that as well? It could be any of you. I don't.
Let me start, and then you get the right answer after that. Obviously, climate change is the big question of how do you simulate it, and we saw the uncertainties in that in the keynote talk. More simply, you can look at climate change as basically climate is moving north. In my perspective, in the Brazilian perspective, it's moving south. Okay, so I'm biased by being north of the equator. And studies have done that it's on the order of 100 kilometers of climate change movement north per century. And so the kind of analysis that I showed you, if we could figure out where this evapotranspiration demand was correlated to geographic features, topography, look 100 kilometers south, that's what your climate's going to look like in 100 years. I mean, use the system to tell you what you're going to see. Because most of what happens in the fields that I'm working with, resource managers, they don't use models the way you guys talk about models. They're very much data-driven. They want to see the data. They want to know where it's coming from. They want to know what you did to it. And they don't trust models. So we're at a quandary because we got to predict the future. No.
This was a huge question, but James is the expert on climate. The only thing I can add to it is that in the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, and as you know, Brazilian agriculture is very advanced and responsible for lots of our GNP. It has lots and lots of advanced modeling on weather and yield, and depending on the model, on the parameters, and of course on what the future, how far south the future will be, or how far north the future will be, there are even perspectives of coffee moving away from Brazil and towards Argentina, okay, which is, of course, we would not like to lose our coffee to anywhere, but especially losing it far south, and the same thing might happen here in the States. So it's a matter of models, but as we saw this morning, the keynote speaker mentioned something about 15 years, and after 15 years, you kind of start losing the reliability of your model. At least that's what I understood for the phenomena he was talking about. So how long do we have to wait until we have to go to Argentina to grow coffee? I don't know if ever, but maybe we have to move north to the States. But this is just an example of the diversity of issues and the variety of futures that we may have concerning all these phenomena and their interactions.
Do I have?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. We do. We have some time.
I was just thinking. I don't have too much experience on climate change data, but I was remember one particular case I have experienced, and it regards also multiscale and correlations. I was thinking about the problem of correlations actually. Kind of eScience, this science approach may, I think, theoretically helps people looking at the same phenomena, but under the point of view, it's totally different that people would think one day. For instance, regarding this, I have been involved in a particular study that regards the input of carbon for plants. And apparently the input of carbon into the leaves of plants is through a biological structure called stomata. And the interesting thing is that they have leaves from that are stored in botanic museums, etc., for the same plant for some centuries, actually, some 100, 150 years or something like this. Then these people, they are able, the biologists, they are able to digitize the plants and then to count, to analyze for the same species the number and the area of such stomata, which serves as actually as input. And they are able to show that the number and the size of stomata is decreasing during the last 150 years. And a hypothesis is that because there's a lot of, there's more and more carbon available, and if the stomata was kept constant, actually, the plant would tend to be fat in the sense of eating more and more, having more and more carbon. And of course, this kind of analysis is a totally different point of view regarding the same problem. And analyzing data in large scale may allow this kind of approach in order to corroborate or to avoid some different species, a different hypothesis, actually.
That's interesting. I didn't know that plants were going on diets.
Oh, no. I'll just...
Closing the mouth.
The diet, yes, the diet. I'm sorry.
no
that will be the last example I give.
Sure.
Because the diet reminded me of another, like little study with lots of consequences on the same way, which is a butterfly diet, okay? And the effect climate, region, and diet has on butterfly wing colors. And if you were doing, for instance, lots of people are proposing image processing of wing patterns and the colors on the wings, thus the algorithms will have to consider climate change, dietary supplements to the butterfly, and wherever the butterfly is migrating to because of climate change, because otherwise the same species will not be recognized. It's changing so much. So
truly multidimensional now. Okay, well, I'd like to go ahead and close at this panel and thank our panelists, everyone. And while you're coming down, yeah? How about, yeah.